By the end of April 2026, the Pentagon told Congress it had spent roughly $25 billion fighting a war against Iran. 2 weeks later, that number had climbed to $29 billion. By late June, the White House was asking for $87 billion more. On the same day, the government signed a $35 billion contract to rebuild the missile stockpiles the war had already burned through. Independent analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies put the true cost, once equipment losses and base repairs are folded in, somewhere between $34 and $42 billion and rising. Add the opening campaign's price tag, nearly $2 billion a day in its first week. And the trajectory is unmistakable. A war that has already cost taxpayers tens of billions of dollars, climbing toward a $50 billion mark and beyond, with no ceiling in sight. Here is the detail that makes this more than a budget story. Congress never voted to authorize it. Not a declaration of war. Not a specific authorization for the use of military force. No formal vote at all, in the sense the Constitution's authors would have recognized. The military campaign against Iran, codenamed Operation Epic Fury, began on February 28, 2026. Months later, the money keeps flowing, the fighting keeps flaring, and the constitutional question that started the whole conversation, who gets to decide when the United States goes to war, remains formally unresolved. This is not a story about one president or one war. It is a story about a structural failure that has been building for 3/4 of a century, and about why the branch of government the Constitution trusted least with the power to start wars has ended up holding it almost by default. To understand how the country arrived here, start with what actually happened, stripped of interpretation. On January 3, 2026, American Special Operations Forces launched a raid into Caracas, Venezuela. In just over 2 hours, they captured President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, flew them to New York, and had them arraigned on narco-trafficking charges within 48 hours. More than 150 aircraft were involved, launched from 20 bases across the Western Hemisphere. Venezuelan officials reported dozens of deaths, most among Maduro's security detail. Congress had not voted to authorize military action against Venezuela. Weeks earlier, senators had tried to force a vote directing troops to stand down from a related buildup in the Caribbean. On January 14th, the Senate deadlocked 50-50, and Vice President J.D. Vance cast the tie-breaking vote against it. The administration's legal justification, later confirmed by multiple officials, rested on a memo from the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. Its argument was narrow and specific. The scale, scope, and duration of the operation did not rise to the level of war in the constitutional sense, and therefore did not require congressional authorization beforehand. A 2-hour raid, in this reading, is fundamentally different from a war. 8 weeks later, that same administration launched something considerably larger. On February 28th, American and Israeli forces began a sustained campaign against Iran's nuclear program, military leadership, and, as the weeks passed, its oil infrastructure and internal security apparatus. This time, the legal reasoning shifted. Officials described the campaign as an act of collective self-defense, undertaken alongside Israel, which the administration characterized as already engaged in an armed conflict with Iran and its regional proxies. By March, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil transits, was effectively closed. By mid-March, Iran struck Qatar's Ras Laffan facility, the world's largest liquefied natural gas export terminal, knocking out a sizable share of its capacity for years and roughly doubling European gas prices overnight. Congress tried, repeatedly, to force a vote. The House blocked a War Powers Resolution 219, 212 in early March. It blocked another 214, 213 in mid-April. The Senate blocked 150, 47 at the end of April, another 50, 49 in mid-May, another 48, 47 in mid-June. Each vote fell almost entirely along party lines, with a small handful of senators. Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Bill Cassidy, occasionally Rand Paul, crossing over. None succeeded in compelling a withdrawal. 2 operations, months apart, different scale, same underlying pattern. Military action initiated by the executive branch, a legal memo explaining why congressional authorization wasn't constitutionally required, and a Congress that tried and failed to reassert control after the fact. The Constitution's text on this question is not ambiguous. Article I gives Congress, not the President, the power to declare war. Article 2 makes the President Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces once Congress has committed the country to a conflict, a role of execution, not initiation. This division was deliberate, and it was close to unanimous among the people who wrote it. Legal historians who have combed through the convention debates and the private correspondence of the framers have found remarkably little disagreement on this point. James Madison, writing to Thomas Jefferson in 1789, described the Constitution as having taken particular care to vest the power to begin a war in the legislature rather than the executive. James Wilson told Pennsylvania's ratifying convention that the system was built specifically to prevent any single person from rushing the country into war. The logic behind that design was structural, not sentimental. A single executive can act quickly, decisively, and in secret. Useful qualities for running a war once it starts, dangerous qualities for deciding whether to start one. A legislature is slower, more public, and more exposed to the political consequences of its votes. The framers wanted exactly that friction. It should be harder to enter a war, they believed, than to leave one. For the Republic's first century and a half, that friction mostly held, in part because the country maintained no standing army large enough to make unilateral war-making practical. A president who wanted to fight a war needed Congress to raise and fund the army to fight it. The check was as much fiscal as it was legal. That equilibrium began to erode in the 20th century, and it eroded specifically as the size of the permanent military grew. By the time the United States entered the Korean War in 1950, President Truman could simply order American forces into combat, describing the conflict as a police action rather than a war, without ever asking Congress for a declaration. Congress registered no serious objection. Vietnam pushed the pattern of erosion to a breaking point. The 1964 Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed on the strength of an incident later shown to have been misrepresented to Congress, gave President Johnson sweeping authority to escalate American involvement in Southeast Asia. When President Nixon then expanded the war into Cambodia in 1970 without new congressional approval, the backlash in Congress was severe enough that lawmakers moved, with real bipartisan force, to claw back the power they felt they had let slip away. The result was the War Powers Resolution of 1973, passed over Nixon's veto. Its structure was straightforward. A president could commit troops to hostilities without prior authorization only in narrow circumstances, had to report to Congress within 48 hours of doing so, and then had 60 days, with a possible 30-day extension, to either secure congressional authorization or withdraw the forces. If Congress wanted to force an earlier withdrawal, it could do so through a concurrent resolution, which would not require the president's signature. That last mechanism turned out to be the law's fatal weakness. In 1983, the Supreme Court decided INS v. Chadha, a case that had nothing to do with war powers on its face, but everything to do with them in its consequences. The court ruled that Congress could not use a legislative veto, a resolution that changes the legal status quo without being presented to the president for signature or veto, to override executive action. That ruling did not strike down the War Powers Resolution directly, but it gutted the enforcement mechanism at its center. Since 1983, the law has operated less as a binding constraint than as a reporting requirement and a political talking point. Then came the September 11th authorizations. The 2001 authorization for use of military force passed against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and the 2002 authorization for the Iraq War both lacked sunset clauses. Successive administrations, Republican and Democratic alike, stretched those authorizations to cover military operations in more than a dozen countries over more than 2 decades, well beyond anything the Congress that passed them in the aftermath of a specific attack likely anticipated. By the time President Obama ordered airstrikes in Libya in 2011 without congressional authorization, his administration had developed a new legal argument to justify it. Because the operation involved no ground troops and no sustained exchange of fire, it did not constitute hostilities under the meaning of the War Powers Resolution, and therefore triggered none of the law's obligations. That scale, scope, duration reasoning, first refined for Libya, then reused in various forms for strikes in Syria under both the Obama and first Trump administrations, is the direct ancestor of the legal memo the Justice Department produced to justify the Venezuela operation in January 2026. This is the through line that matters more than any single president. Each unauthorized use of force does not just resolve one dispute. It becomes precedent for the next one, cited by administrations of both parties, expanding the definition of what the executive can do without Congress a little further each time. By May 2026, the administration's position had shifted again. In a letter to Congress dated May 1st, coinciding, not coincidentally, with the 60-day deadline under the War Powers Resolution, the White House stated that hostilities with Iran, which had begun on February 28th, had terminated following a ceasefire ordered on April 7th. If hostilities had ended, the argument went, there was nothing left for the 60-day clock to apply to. 38 Senate Democrats, led by Adam Schiff, Tim Kaine, and Chuck Schumer, rejected that framing in a formal letter of their own. Their argument drew on a combination of legislative history and current facts. The House committee report that originally defined hostilities for the War Powers Resolution had deliberately chosen a broad standard, encompassing situations of confrontation and clear danger even without active gunfire, specifically so presidents could not define their way around the law. And as a factual matter, the senators noted, the administration's own Central Command had confirmed weeks earlier that more than 15,000 American troops, 200 aircraft, and 20 warships remained deployed to enforce a naval blockade of Iranian ports. A blockade, they pointed out, has been treated as an act of war under American law since the Supreme Court's 1862 prize cases decision, a precedent from the Civil War era that has never been overturned. The senators requested that the administration release the legal opinion behind its termination claim. As of this writing, it has not been made public. That dispute is not simply partisan noise. It reflects a genuine and long-running disagreement inside the American legal establishment about where presidential authority ends. One side of that debate holds that the pattern of nearly 250 years of practice, from Jefferson's undeclared naval campaign against the Barbary pirates through Korea, Panama, Libya, and now Iran, has itself established a body of accepted precedent for limited unilateral presidential action, particularly in defense of American personnel, assets, and allies. Proponents of this view, including at least one former head of the Justice Department's own Office of Legal Counsel, argue that the more meaningful check on presidential war-making was never meant to be a lawsuit. It was meant to be Congress cutting off funding, the way it eventually did to end American involvement in Vietnam. On this view, the fact that Congress has voted repeatedly and failed to stop the Iran war is itself evidence that the system is working as designed. The elected legislature considered the question and declined to intervene. The competing view, held by most constitutional scholars who study the framers' original design, is that this reading inverts the Constitution's actual structure. It was never supposed to require an act of extraordinary political will from Congress to stop a war already underway. It was supposed to require an act of congressional will to start one in the first place. Treating silence or gridlock as authorization, in this view, quietly transfers the war power from the body the Constitution assigned it to the body the Constitution never gave it to at all. The courts, for their part, have mostly declined to settle the question. Judges have repeatedly treated disputes over the War Powers Resolution as political questions better resolved between the elected branches than by judicial ruling, which means the law has rarely been tested where it would matter most, in front of a court willing to enforce it. It is worth pausing on the fact that lawmakers did try. Between January and June of 2026, Congress held at least 8 recorded votes on resolutions to limit or end the Venezuela and Iran operations. Every one of them failed. Understanding why requires looking past any individual vote and toward the incentives shaping the institution as a whole. A vote to authorize or end a war concentrates political risk on the individual member who casts it, in a way the underlying decision to go to war does not. A senator who votes to cut off funding for an active military operation owns every subsequent headline about American losses or the appearance of abandoning troops in the field, regardless of what the true costs or benefits of the operation turn out to be. A senator who avoids that vote entirely bears none of that risk personally, even while the war proceeds exactly as it would have otherwise. That asymmetry, concentrated cost for the individual who acts, diffuse cost for the institution that does nothing, is a structural reason collective bodies systematically underuse powers that require an affirmative vote to exercise, even when a majority privately favors using them. With midterm elections in November 2026, that calculation was especially sharp. Several senators facing competitive races that year had every reason to prefer no recorded vote at all over one that could be used against them from either direction. The power of the purse, meanwhile, has weakened in a specific, mechanical way. Emergency supplemental appropriations, the kind used to fund the Iran war, are generally treated as exempt from the statutory budget caps that constrain ordinary spending. That means an $87 billion request adds directly to the deficit rather than displacing other programs, which removes one of the more visible political costs that might otherwise generate resistance. Nobody has to explain what got cut to pay for it. There is also a self-reinforcing constituency for continuation. The same week the administration requested its supplemental, the Pentagon awarded a $35 billion contract to Lockheed Martin to rebuild the missile defense stockpiles the war had depleted. Defense contractors, the communities built around their factories, and the members of Congress who represent those communities all have a direct financial stake in sustained military spending. Not necessarily a corrupting one, but a real one, and one that runs in the opposite direction from any vote to wind the conflict down. None of this requires assuming anyone acted in bad faith. Individually, a senator avoiding a politically costly vote, a defense contractor fulfilling a legitimate government contract, and a White House lawyer building the strongest available legal case for the president's authority are all behaving in ways that make sense from where they sit. The problem is what those individually rational choices add up to at the institutional level. A Congress that retains the formal power to stop a war and almost never exercises it. The costs did not stay contained to the Pentagon's ledger. A Tomahawk cruise missile costs roughly $2 million. Hundreds were fired in the war's first weeks alone. An SM-3 interceptor runs about $36 million. A single carrier strike group costs upward of $6.5 million a day just to keep at sea. Those figures explain how a military campaign can burn through $11 billion in its first 6 days without a single American ground unit engaged in sustained combat. The second-order effects reached further than the battlefield. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz pushed oil prices above $100 a barrel, briefly spiking above $119. The strike on Qatar's LNG terminal took a significant share of global gas export capacity offline for years, not months, and roughly doubled wholesale European gas prices in the process. A cost borne largely by consumers who had no vote on the war at all, on a different continent, with no say in the matter whatsoever. By late June, as a ceasefire framework signed in Islamabad took hold and the strait reopened, oil prices retreated to the $70 range, illustrating just how much of the war's economic cost was concentrated in the uncertainty itself, not only the fighting. The third-order effect is the hardest to price and the most important to understand: precedent. Every time an administration successfully sustains a military operation for months without congressional authorization and without a court intervening to stop it, the legal and political cost of doing so again drops a little further. The Venezuela operation's scale, scope, and duration memo drew directly on reasoning developed for Libya in 2011 and Syria in 2018. The next unauthorized operation, under whichever party holds the White House next, will very likely draw on the memos written to justify Venezuela and Iran in 2026. This is not a hypothetical slippery slope. It is the documented pattern of the last 75 years, repeating on a shortening cycle. None of this settles the underlying legal question, and honest analysis should resist the temptation to pretend it does. Reasonable legal scholars, examining the same constitutional text and the same 250-year record of practice, reach genuinely different conclusions about where the line between presidential and congressional war power actually sits. And the Supreme Court has spent decades declining the opportunities it has had to draw that line more precisely. What is not contested is the practical outcome. Public opinion on the Iran war itself was closely divided and, in most polling, unfavorable. Surveys in early March found approval ranging from roughly a quarter to just over 40%, with even historically sympathetic outlets showing an even split. And yet that divided public sentiment translated into no institutional check capable of altering the war's course. Congress voted against the war repeatedly, and the war continued regardless. Whatever one believes about the wisdom of the Iran or Venezuela operations on the merits, the mechanism by which the decision was made, and by which it will likely be made again, has drifted a long way from the one the Constitution's authors described in 1787. A legislature, not an executive, deciding whether the country goes to war, before the fact rather than after it. Step back from Venezuela and Iran specifically, and a longer pattern comes into focus. Korea normalized undeclared war as police action. Vietnam produced a law meant to reverse that trend. The Supreme Court, in a case about immigration procedure, quietly disabled that law's enforcement mechanism a decade later. 2 open-ended terrorism authorizations, passed in the shock of a single attack, became the legal basis for military operations across a dozen countries over 2 decades. Libya refined a legal test. Measure the scale, scope, and duration of an operation, and if it falls short of hostilities, no authorization is required. That has since been reused, with only minor modification, to justify a raid in Caracas and a war against Iran in the same 6-month span. Each step in that sequence was defensible on its own terms to the administration that took it. Each step also moved the baseline a little further from where the framers set it, and each new administration inherited a slightly wider set of tools than the one before. That is what makes this a story about a system rather than a person. No single president built this arrangement, and no single president is likely to dismantle it because the incentives that produced it. For the executive to act first and defend the legality later, for individual lawmakers to avoid the political cost of a recorded vote, for institutions everywhere to prefer the exercise of power to the harder work of constraining it. Do not change with the results of any one election. The $50 billion figure is not really the story. It is the receipt. The actual story is the decades-long transfer of a power the Constitution placed in the hands of the many into the hands of the few. Not through any single dramatic act, but through a long accumulation of votes not taken, laws not enforced, and precedents quietly left standing. Understanding how that transfer happened, mechanism by mechanism, is the only way to recognize it the next time it happens again. Because on the evidence of the last 75 years, it will.